In today's episode on progressive economics, we wanted to talk about a letter that was sent by a series of the world's basically biggest economists in support of Zoran Mamdani, the New York, well, the perhaps soon-to-be New York mayor. And we wanted to break down what exactly the nature of the support is for the economics community of someone like Mamdani as a leftist figure. But we're not interested in breaking down his plan or costing his plan, but looking at whether or not it seems as if what is particularly being supported by these economists is simply the discipline of economics itself, whether we've reached a certain rift point at which you either support concepts like the welfare state, markets, trade, basic notions of finance, or are those concepts not simply becoming intellectually outdated, but even kind of historically losing their edge? They're no longer the sort of useful social technologies they've proved to be for hundreds of years. And therefore, again, whether or not these progressive economists are not really just supporting Mamdani as an attempt to support economics itself. You know, they're confronting these challenges around spending, trying to find massive amounts of money to keep society going, to keep the basic fixtures of our society going, from public transit to hospitals and the education system to ensuring basic food security. Now, I don't think you really have to be a leftist to see that economics seems to be struggling with the basic variables of what are supposed to underpin our economic decisions. And so we want to break down that history, and we want to look at whether or not, in looking at this history, we can come up with some alternative to economics.
Yeah, and it might help to say that I think that, you know, to your point, that maybe it's easy to tell that economics has failed in a major way. I think, especially if you're kind of an average person, you know, if you look at wealth distribution, or, you know, even basic tenets, right? In the United States, people are often citing things like, you know, life expectancy has increased X amount, but now it's actually on the decline in some cases, and there are sort of major gaps in things like public infrastructure that are not supported by economics at this point, that are kind of just totally failing, and so maybe that's how we've arrived at this point where there needs to be this, like, you know, this progressive economics.
Well, they've emerged hoping to say, no, economics can still describe society, and that economic technology can still help us make decisions, even though it seems as if, and this is one of the delicious paradoxes of it, the issues that we're dealing with seem to be, in a strange way, caused by economics. They're caused by social technologies that, you know, are kind of without a master, and we're exerting an enormous amount of social effort to basically pay, you know, to keep something like the monetary system afloat, to keep something like private finance afloat, to keep something like the economic descriptions and decision-making processes of economics itself alive. And this has emerged as a political decision that, again, is Mamdani's platform, is a modern kind of social democratic platform, really fundamentally anything but a giant ad for, no, we need to maintain all of these axioms of industrial productivity, the monetary and price systems, our tax and wage systems, even as over time we've increasingly made more and more concessions to private forces, erosion of, as you already mentioned, parts of the public sphere, from infrastructure to public services. But this is the paradox, I think, that we're trying to break down in this episode. It's this paradox of, but we only have a hospital or a road or, again, massive amounts of debt because we're in a specific system. And so it's a bit of a contradiction, because, of course, it's this system that has generated these excessive imbalances. It's the system that describes them. Maybe to an extent, it's even the system that we use to try and help us get out of them. But this is where the kind of reflexive paradox, as it were, of this reaches a certain pitch. And we either have to say, okay, no, there's still room for economics as a discipline, as a kind of sort of quasi-science, as a social technology to improve, or we need to go back and figure out what the timeline is. What does it mean to say that economics is a system? How old is this system? What are its basic principles? How has it perhaps defined all of our concepts of public and private systems, so that we can't really come up again with a coherent rejection or critique of economics without fundamentally re-exploring its basic principles and positions.
Right. And so I think maybe it makes sense for us to maybe take a step back and look at how we've been leading to this moment, basically.
We need to answer the question, like, what is economics? I mean, kind of stupidly. And you can't really go to an economics textbook because it's more a historical problem and a political problem. We can describe economics as a sort of, science of management or household management or the organization of the household, whether it's an actual household or a state or a company. But I think for us, and we have to go back to this moment around, I think, really around the 13th century and early 14th century, in which a series of variables basically emerge to create something called the commodity. And to an extent, it's an old idea to go look at this thing called the commodity and try and understand what is the basic thing that economics deals with. Well, a good, like an object, something that is produced and then sold in something like a market. But when did markets as we know them emerge? When did the commodity as we know it emerge? And it took a series of elements from the birth of basically banking in these Italian city-states, the beginning of using finance, using debt as a primary input. Debt, typically in medieval societies, was something that happened at the end of a process, right? You have surplus at the end of a good harvest. It's not necessarily that you start with surplus. It's not that there weren't sort of primitive forms of investment. But imagine if every single thing that you did in economy was definable as an investment. Well, then you would get the modern economy and you would get modern market society. And really, this process begins about 700 years ago. And city-states in Italy are kind of experimenting with forms of finance. They're receiving an interesting kind of human movement and increased trade. Society is kind of broadening to do with other facilitating forces. All the way up in England, you have the beginnings of the commercialization of land. Around 1280, they published a series of laws that basically say, okay, this system of vassalage, this system of land defines everyone's relationship to everyone else, but that land can only be owned by the king, broken down and passed to his lords, who then further alienate the land into smaller and smaller packages of land. This system is called vassalage. You become a vassal of someone else, of a lord. You become, in some respect, bound to a lord through some obligation or duty to produce on the land for them. And of course, there's no life without land. So in this sense, this version of a medieval economy, that we're using that word retrospectively, is a land-based one. Whereas the moment that they start to say, well, you can actually buy land, you can pay your way out of servitude, and not simply in specific cases, but it becomes a kind of the beginnings of a commercial right. This is a sort of second pillar, if you want, to the finance elements. You have sort of finance, you have the commercialization of land. And then the third thing is really the beginnings of sort of international markets. There was always global trade, organized in empires or across countries, going back to the Romans and earlier. But the beginnings of a system that wouldn't just trade objects of value or precious objects or textiles or tapestries, you have the beginnings of everything is kind of equal. It's called a commodity because we have the beginnings of what we spoke about a few episodes back, this 360-degree view. It's not just an object that has a certain social texture, that is integrated into the land, a way of doing things. But once you take the object outside of that social form, it kind of breaks down. If I don't have, the specific tool for raking or hoeing the land, if I'm not in that particular farm world, if I'm not doing agriculture, it kind of breaks down. But suddenly there's this idea that is born that, well, you can have an international market that can share goods, and those goods in being shared in that way can mean that no matter where you are, say within the continent of Europe and elsewhere, you can begin to install, right, production. And once you put together all these three elements, you get the beginnings of market society, right? Once you have finance, so investment is the beginning. So there's no naive social forms anymore. People just doing things because they've been doing it for hundreds of years, or because they owe something to a particular land or ancestry or lord, or they have a particular set of social commitments. Suddenly you have everything will be a species of finance. You have the commercialization of land, right? So now land, the ultimate guarantor of life and of the system of medieval rights, gets exchanged for the beginnings of a system of commercial rights. So commerce will come to be supreme. And finally, you have, the production of these things called commodities, which means that as long as I have access to a market, I can start a scheme of production. I can make my farm. I can make my, whatever the processes of production, which were quite primitive then. But again, whether it's doing goldsmithing, or maybe you're going to start from the finance end of things, it doesn't particularly matter. You start to break down every social process into a process of production, where we consider these things to be equivalent now, right? Society and production, we conceive of the end of society as one of production. Mm-hmm. Production was a specific way of more neutrally doing things, right? As a increasingly individualized and commercialized enterprise. And this spreads like wildfire. And we call this market society, or another word for it is, of course, capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Right. And now it seems like we've basically arrived at a place where this is, once again, maybe even now, this form is breaking down, right? As that broke down, this form of, like you said, doing things because they were traditional or of the land or serving a very specific system. Now we're seeing things, I don't know, through the lens of, again, inflation and remilitarization and all of these things. We're maybe now even seeing that breakdown, right? Access to markets in these ways, treating objects as commodities, having an entire system based on market society. Like we're maybe perhaps witnessing our own revolution, though it seems like the answer that we're getting, maybe out of these people that are like progressive economists, is not to go a step further or imagine something new or look at things, critically, retroactively, but rather to reaffirm many of the things of this system that are in fact breaking down. Even the progressives, right, are not giving us a way out, are not giving us a new revolution in economics.
Probably because, one, it's very difficult to imagine what structured this beginning. Why now? Why do I say that the 13th century or early 14th century? It took lots of time, right, to get even to the point where some of these processes, like finance, like the commercialization of land, they had to reach a certain maturity level before they could even become formal social processes. Mm-hmm. I mean, those laws that I mentioned that emerged in the 1280s in England, they're basically the end of a process. This was happening for generations already, this kind of commercial exchange of land, the capacity to negotiate commercially with, the fundamental variable, which is land. It would take hundreds of years before they would get rid of the king. The king continued to underpin this system. And in fact, you could almost say that the state, the modern state, is sort of commerce plus, but you still have your king. Mm-hmm. You still have some higher order authority which organizes, which guarantees the meaning, say, of ownership, right? Rather than a system of, say, total anarchy, of pure commercialization, which of course did eventually emerge as a fantasy in the 20th century. Though it existed in fits and starts earlier, when people say, okay, yeah, well, why don't we just have a pure market society?
Right.
But understanding, obviously, this beginning, like, why did it happen? Well, I would say that it partly happened when it happened because something was simply so radical, so addictively radical about the commodity. It is just such an astonishingly brilliant idea. And you can almost even get, if you want, a little bit mystical and say, well, maybe the commodity is a kind of, sort of software update to reality that whether we had to go through it or not, I don't know. but certainly it adds a texture to reality that is very difficult to put back. In fact, our concept of reality, I would argue, comes from the 360-degree view of the commodity. Like our principle for what is really real, what even in some respects distinguishes us moderns from the ancients, right, which is a difficult line to draw in the sand, is somehow the fact that we believe in 360-degree views. And the way that ultimately this 360-degree view had to be guaranteed was through a market society. Markets can kind of imagine 360 degrees kind of materially in a way that I think we struggle with cognitively. Like literally we can only fantastically come up with a 360-degree object, which maybe we kind of revolve in our heads in a kind of phantom performance. But markets literally allowed us to act as if this view of reality really existed, because all I had to do was go to the marketplace, right, and treat a bushel of wheat, right, or some wool, or anything, a brick, a basket, an agricultural tool, even money itself, as if it had this kind of 360-degree viewpoint, as if it was like a perfect object. I think this was simply too addictive. So that, yeah, okay, sure, 700 years later, the addiction means that, well, we don't have another concept of reality. And it's difficult for us to say, let's go backwards, because we don't even recognize that this was kind of an update, because one, well, what was there before? And two, what could possibly be thereafter? Like, do we ourselves have the condition to come up with like another software update? I mean, I think this is partly the distinctions. These are the distinctions we have to sort of establish. The software update happened almost kind of randomly, but when it did, it took off. Whereas I don't think we're in a more ambiguous place. I mean, I didn't necessarily want to rush here, but the internet is like basically why we're, I think, going through this process. I think we have a software update.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, I think that this speaks to sort of like you said, that the fact that it's 700 years old, right? And it's such an addictive concept, and that it actually structures basically reality and the way that we think about reality even, is something that the progressive economists are maybe not even willing to admit, right? That it's as if that this is a concept in nature, right? The market or exchange or commodity, that, this is something that we just can't be divorced from, but we need to figure out a way to make it work, or to save it, or to make it work for us in a new modern context, right? Like that's going to be the division between the moderns and the ancients, is not getting rid of this viewpoint or this system, but is rather finally making it work for us through these optimizations. And yeah, I think that that's part of the thing with, again, we don't want to fully cost it out, but if you look at a lot of the kind of Zoran policies, they're so much closer to reaffirming this than to moving anywhere beyond it or providing us with anything new, right? A rent freeze doesn't examine, who owns the real estate debt, or what goes into the creation of housing, or how we conceive of housing through the lens of, it being a financial instrument. It really doesn't. The same thing with public transit. I mean, even the idea of, guaranteeing, public transit as a social right, in the French Revolution and American Revolution, we have, individualistic freedom from tyranny, speech, religion, property. Okay, 20th century welfare states add, housing, healthcare, education, jobs. And now in the 21st century, freedom of movement, food sovereignty, these things. Maybe it seems kind of radical, but it actually isn't necessarily.
Well, it's a liberalism. And I mean, liberalism was the revolution that installed probably really the most modern stage of the political definition of market society. Like we've had the kind of chaos of hundreds of years, starting in the 1300s, trying to figure out what market society would look like. And with market society, it's almost as if we created a mirror. And we made this mirror in such a way that reflected what we were making. And in a way, we were kind of making the mirror, or we were sort of fitting mirrors in to a society that we were building, but we're going to the mirror to tell us what reality was. And of course, it just reflected back what it saw. And it becomes very, very difficult to try and build another society in that situation. You don't have anywhere to go back to. Part of the sort of angst and the existentialism of, 20th century modernity, the way it was reflected in literature, the way it exploded in the world wars, almost a reaction to the chaos of the industrialization of the 19th century, is you get this existential angst about, but can we go back? And if so, to what? Like, can you go back to the pre-capitalist medieval period or the ancient period, which many people fantasized about? And I think, well, no, because it's not as if there's a stable reality that just exists, and then human beings come and put on certain plays, and we call these society. There's a sense that reality, which doesn't just naively exist, seems to need a certain amount of social imagination and fiction and these plays called society in order to work. And so once you make a transition to a market society, and it takes hundreds of years, but you also start to create society in the image of a market. I mean, this is where you get the birth of materialism and our concept of reality. We made buildings with the viewpoint of markets embedded into them. A really good example of this is a church, the cathedral building that emerges. There's lots of church building, but church building is a phenomenon. Church building, at the extent to which it eventually was done actually in market society, and kind of early market society, still it's sort of high medieval society. But the way that we created space, not space necessarily for people to go in and do something specific. Yes, there were the rituals of prayer and there was the daily masses, but compare, for instance, the church to the monastery. The monastery was the social form that almost the church in a funny way kind of replaces, because it was the monks who, in the fall of the Roman Empire, for hundreds of years took on the religion of Christianity. In the kind of abyss of the early state, they took on the infrastructure projects. They took on the concepts of faith. They took on the mission of conversion, and they went to the ends of the earth in order to do so. So it's funny that eventually a church emerges, this kind of empty space. And is it not that in some sense the empty space is a 360-degree view? It's a way that a church can be imagined as something empty because we can imagine it as a perfect object, i.e. an object not necessarily filled with those traditional social relations. Maybe it's not an accident that Christianity was the ultimate emancipatory religion in some cases because it didn't have any particular traditional practices. It had those that were kind of retroactively installed by the Catholic Church, by the Orthodox traditions, but the original emancipatory moment of Christianity isn't this. But this is a long detour into the concept and design of a church to give us a sense. But you can see how every building maybe we would make, from the merchant houses of Amsterdam in the 17th century, when they were the richest country in GDP terms per capita. Whatever house building you're looking at, you start to build them as if they're 360-degree objects. You build them independent of who lives in them. This is not just an extension of commercialism, and that you have a system of endless trade, of the beginnings of property ownership, which will get, again, their fullest political expression in the late 18th century, when everyone is declared a property owner, and the old monarchies of Europe are eventually all dismantled. This is also quite simply what the software update is to reality when you look at the commodity. Objects are 360 degrees, even a tree, even pieces of nature that we're not even necessarily commercializing or know how to commercialize. But you have the 360-degree viewpoint. And you have, and that's market society, and that's the thing that we've been trying to coordinate for 700 years.
I guess I want to ask what you mean exactly by the 360-degree view in comparison of how we were seeing things before this.
Well, we have, obviously, cognitively, we see in 3 dimensions. We have, concept of space. It's about when you start to put space into objects. Now, you might say, but what about Greek sculpture? When they were building these humans, not wanting to depict gods, and you had the full 360-degree viewpoint. Well, that's great. And they did it as a particular social and artistic practice. What if I told you every object has to be like a Greek sculpture? Then you would get market society. So it's not as if we haven't had examples of 360-degree viewpoints. Again, one, we have just we have a cognitive relationship with 360 degrees. We can't directly experience 360 degrees, but we have a cognitive relationship with 360 degrees. And historically, we have instances where we've obviously made objects, which have, again, objects that tend to have pure artistic value. Those are the commodity is an object that has pure artistic value, but it doesn't have art. And it's not a social practice. It's not a particular instantiation. And market society simply represents when you turn every single object into this kind of thing. And again, there's another piece of the puzzle, which of course I mentioned, was finance. Now, finance is a very good way for turning everything into a perfect object, right? Because you can take the medieval castle and you can say, well, I can take each and every single one of the inputs into this castle. I can find an international price for it, because you start with the sheep, and the sheep give you the value of land, because the amount of sheep you can fit and the amount of wool that you get from each of those sheep tell you the value of the land. Well, then that can tell you the value of the bricks, the mortar. You can even start to value people's time, and you get the beginnings of a labor concept. This gives you a 360-degree price for the castle. And once you can do this, it's a sort of social fantasy, because you've got to follow it through and start to figure out the actual institutions that are going to coordinate this, right? Capitalism begins as a financial phenomenon, not unsurprisingly, because finance was the first place where you could very easily compute this. You could very easily literally write down in a ledger through the technology of the price the significance of something becoming a 360-degree object and the beginnings of the organization of the international market and commodity system.
So now this has trapped us in a way. We can't, like you said, we can't put this viewpoint, this 360 viewpoint, back in the box. We haven't been able to escape this way of looking at things, especially in terms of maybe even, I don't know, in a way getting back to that, like you said, looking at the monastery as a social function, as what the monks actually did, because we've spoke about this before. I mean, there's the spiritual dimension, right, of them taking on the mission of Christianity. There's also the dimension of them doing farming and archiving and irrigation and all of these things that you lose when you can have anyone in a home, or anyone even in a church, or anyone eating a watermelon at any point in time, anywhere in the world, not the watermelon harvester in the country where the watermelon is grown, being eaten in the season and when it's most ripe, right? We kind of lost a dimension that is almost like a little bit both, like more spiritual, but also more functional. Like we moved past it in a way, but we moved past it. We also, I don't know, in my mind, almost kind of lost something.
We added a dimension of efficiency to the process. We said, well, why not take irrigation and archiving and agriculture and do it as a commercial practice? Right? Commercializing something does not necessarily mean profit-seeking. People have this impression of capitalism, or the beginnings of capitalism, or even, again, modern capitalism, as a system which is wrong because it turns things into profit. But that's not the problem. In fact, it's not even necessarily a problem what capitalism does. What it simply does is it says, well, look, take this process, and if you imagine it commercially, you can imagine it efficiently. You can imagine it in a highly reproducible way. That reproducibility is what gets you that watermelon wherever you want in the world, because suddenly it's not just that the watermelon can travel suddenly 100 kilometers or 300 kilometers or 3,000, depending on the scale of your market society and the reach of your international markets. But you also allow people to be able to start their watermelon farm, or whatever it particular is, or their irrigation system anywhere, because markets have the tools now with which people can, from anywhere, begin a process of production, right? And therefore, the great challenge of society does become this expansion of markets, because it's an expansion of efficiency, it's an expansion of investment technology, right? All the money that has to move around, because everything begins as an investment, right? There is no medieval surplus. You start with surplus. Again, why? Because you start with finance. You want the financialized view of the object. It's the most efficient, the most optimized. So the obsession of society comes to be with this expansion of market society. the biggest moment that becomes an interruption to this, and it's a huge reference point for modern politics, is colonialism. There's a worthy detour here to kind of break this down, because colonialism is the last sort of form of market society before we get to industrialization, and really the kind of the beginning of I would say kind of the modern economy as we have it, in its industrial form. And colonialism was funny because what it emerged as was, you're doing this big expansion of market society, but you still have states, you still have monarchs, and these monarchs, however, are getting enriched by a new process. They're not getting enriched by conquering anymore, right? They're getting enriched through a process of basically kind of wealth management, through the concept of revenue. Revenue will become the crucial way that states organize their domestic affairs. And if they're not going to conquer a country next to them to get wealth and hoard it, they say, well, why don't we begin building these great ships, going off to lands we haven't discovered, finding objects that are of particularly high value. Everyone maybe can do wool, or everyone can do textiles. Of course, some countries do dominate this, but they're seeking advantage. They want even imperial advantage. They want wealth at a scale that conquering used to earn them. And they're not going to necessarily, it's not going to happen in the domestic sphere or in the sort of European continental sphere. So they start to look elsewhere, and they don't just find, precious spices. They also begin to find things like gold, and they also begin to find souls to convert. And it's like an entire new social form emerges. And this social form accelerates so many things. It accelerates bookkeeping and accounting technology. It accelerates navigational technology. Imagine what happens to the systems of finance, of banking, when they have to start bankrolling tens of thousands of ships to go around the world, when they have to start itemizing gold coming from wherever, or plots of land, right? This system creates a form of hoarding that isn't based in the feudal state, but it's based in something called mercantilism. And when industrialism emerges, and it creates the capacity for productive economics to reset itself in the domestic sphere, because you can continue to have market expansion, not by going abroad, but by bankrolling industrial production in your own border. Suddenly this becomes possible because a new explosion of technologies are suddenly available, right? Things like the mechanical loom, so textiles, so the clothes that people wear, the basic fabric of society literally becomes subject to, through mechanization, becomes subject to commercialization. That's the great insight of the Industrial Revolution. And out of this process, you have actually modern political economy, the actual so-called moral science, the philosophy of political economy emerges. And the funniest part of it is that it emerges as a critique of the inefficiencies of colonialism, right? So all of the arguments about free trade that will emerge at this moment, liberal and open markets, the private person, private property as a universal right, all things that many people rather ignorantly associate with the power grabbing of these settler colonies, on the contrary, emerged as a sort of attempt to scientifically reject and deconstruct the inefficiencies and excesses of colonialism, which were simply, again, they were efficient up until a certain point, but they created extraordinary exorbitances and excesses that they just didn't know how to deal with.
Yeah, can we break that down a little further? Because I know that the sort of the shift from colonialism into mercantilism is really closely tied, but I'm not totally familiar with that. Like, maybe we can speak to some of the excesses. I know part of it was like, eventually once you had that industrial mechanization, the colonies almost became like sources of raw resources that then could be brought back to the mother country and turned into something and then exported, which was like a bit of a shift from just going there and getting the objects.
Well, colonialism was always going there and getting something. from the very beginnings of the system, the 16th century, early 17th century, and they're starting to name the colonies in the Americas. And of course, again, Magellan is going around the world, and Christopher Columbus. Like this is the beginning. It begins when capitalism is already 300 years old, mm-hmm. and commercialization has already struck Europe completely. It doesn't mean that there aren't tons of, moving and exchanging borders and, but you also have something like the Protestant Reformation. You have a change in the internal religious status where people want, right, more individualism. They recognize that there's something incompatible about the Catholic faith with the way the individual is being described by market society. And this is what necessitates the Protestant Reformation. It doesn't mean that that was just shamelessly for economics. Again, if capitalism is a sort of a software update, and then so is the Protestant Reformation. But mercantilism is really just a bigger way of describing the colonialism. I mean, it's just when colonialism starts to build international markets at a global scale, you get a mercantile system. You get a system of trade and exchange that is happening between colonies, between empires, and this is where wars are waged. This is where how enormous amount of human life is organized. Really, mercantilism and colonialism, those are the systems that end with the Industrial Revolution, right? In the late 18th century, the 1760s in England, they get the mechanical loom, and that ends the need for a description and a reliance upon a mercantile system. It's not that it goes away instantly. It lasts for many more generations, and in fact, people would argue there's still wealth that is there to this day. And this is what grounds partly the colonial critique of these either settler or formerly imperial societies. But the point that, again, I think is so important to emphasize is that all of the freedoms that we associate on the one hand with modern life emerge as a critique of colonialism. And that also many of the things that we consider to be kind of, again, excesses of power, using debt as an instrument to organize and rule and regulate society. Oh, that's a concept that goes back to colonialism. It doesn't. The modern concept of debt, yes, is related to a 700-year-old concept of debt, which we associate with capitalism. So maybe you'd be right to criticize capitalism. But colonialism was a particularly strange kind of hoard within the terms of international market society. And all of modern economics, which again, many people also consider to be the discipline and language of power, which is used to reinforce all kinds of power dynamics, fundamentally emerged as a critique of colonialism because it was too inefficient. People started to come up with concepts of things called absolute and comparative advantage. People like Adam Smith and later David Ricardo started to say things like, well, actually, trade is really good. Not this kind of like, we're going to hoard the resources of colonies and then force you to buy them from us and create these inflated markets. Mm-hmm. But we actually want people to trade. It is more efficient if there is international trade, because when there is at least an industrialization, when you have domestic industrial productive capacity, you get the beginnings of something called comparative advantage, which means even if you can do something quicker than another country, it's often more advantageous nonetheless for you to trade with them. And there was various examples used, but this is a small example, and there are many, many examples of why did competitive trade become, again, the beginnings of liberalism allowed a level of expansion of private commercial opportunity unlike anything we'd ever seen. Napoleon comes in and he massively expands the concept of liberal markets across the entire continent. And he reinforces it in an empire, but basically he's just spreading the value of commercial freedoms. Mm-hmm. And it's this process that eventually leads us to the 20th century and our present moment.
Right, because there was this almost like strange view in mercantilism that it was as if wealth was like finite, right? That there was like that and that if you were an import nation, you were sort of getting screwed over. You needed to be exporting, and then you needed to be hoarding that wealth. And that was what was discovered to be, radically inefficient, unbelievable. And then that's what we moved on from. That maybe people are not totally familiar with, right? But yeah, I think it's an important thing to note.
it was the beginning of reliance on other nations, right? It was the beginning of kind of a system of international cooperation.
Yeah, because that protectionist economic policy is also super tied to nationalism, right? Like we are winning in trade. Like there are real winners and real losers, and if you're Spain, you want to be constantly winning, just stockpiling that gold, and then eventually we realize that that's not actually the most efficient way to. Yeah.
Exactly. And so sometimes it was helpful if one country produces one thing and another, so that you do not waste resources trying to reinforce this protectionist and isolationist form of market economics, which also, again, relies upon a system of colonial hoarding and colonization in order to maintain the fact that this is actually an extremely inefficient economics. And we are in a process of inefficiency right now. And it's this process of inefficiency which, sort of transitioning now to our kind of modern progressive economics and economists that they're trying to solve. It's almost as if, to your point, we've had a series of junctures, right? We've had the birth of capitalism and market society. We've had the turn into colonization. We've had the turn into industrialization, the beginnings of the critique of those inefficiencies, and the beginning of all of our wonderful concepts from liberal freedom to international cooperation and modern industrial markets. And it's like each of these moments had a previous system that was considered inefficient. But the inefficiency only emerged once the new system was beginning to install itself, right? It's a kind of comparative inefficiency. If you stay in the old system, you can easily say, well, I don't know, it doesn't feel inefficient. It's only inefficient if you want to take on the language of efficiency and optimization. Hence why the software update argument is so important. People could not help themselves. They didn't feel as if they had a choice. And so, we want to break down some of these progressive economists. We want to look at what are, some of the answers, either for trying to say, nope, the 700-year timeline needs to keep going, or, how to discuss some of the alternatives or options or even establishment answers we have in view of the fact that we seem to be at another tipping point. And what exactly is that tipping point? Is it the internet, or is this a kind of mirage?
Well, yeah, I think that's... Yeah, now, as we've said, we're at the point where it's unfortunate because they are quite considered our most progressive economists, but in many ways they are perhaps not very progressive, right? A lot of the theory and the policy that's put forward, again, it's also interesting because a lot of these economists, if you were to go and read what they actually put out and what they think. In some cases, it's actually very in opposition to what someone like Mamdani is proposing, right? I think Mamdani's policies, as we've said, are in fact very establishment, right? It's like if you want to levy a tax on financial transactions, right, by the ultra wealthy, it's going to require financialized capitalism and an ultra wealthy class in order to generate that money. Which to me, it seems, almost obvious, but that to me affirms a system in which the ultra wealthy who are performing highly speculative transactions will always need to exist necessarily to fund things like childcare, grocery stores, public transit, or whatever.
Not that Mamdani is aware, I suppose, of this toxic relationship. And this is maybe an important distinction between academics and politicians. Politicians, kind of the irony is lost on them, and they end up generating these kinds of monsters, these kind of impossible systems that people nonetheless are obliged to perform, to install, to coordinate and organize. But the economists, the academic economists, are not better. And this is an important distinction. What we're talking with is a class of academic economists who are progressive in one sense because they're inclined to favor something like, well, we need income redistribution, or we do need high taxes. And there isn't another class of economists that seriously argues otherwise. And this might be a surprise to some people. They, well, what do you mean? The libertarian economists. But in many ways, they're not really academic economists. A libertarian economist is somebody who wants that form of pure market freedom that we discussed earlier. Right. It's not really a form of economics. It's a sort of form of politics, more a form of like pure commercial freedom in which, one can imagine this. There isn't necessarily a society associated with it, which is why these libertarians are often kind of closeted anarchists. Once again, which is why the progressive economists seem to be defenders, sort of knights of capital S society. We've had a view of society we've been building for 700 years. These economists are coming out and saying, well, look, if you reject Mamdani, you're rejecting the concept of taxes. You're rejecting the concept of revenue, the concept of wages, the concept of profit. But their illusion, and we'll break down some of their thoughts and their names in a moment, but to get generally at the picture here, their illusion is that there's some way to equilibrate this system. There's some way, and maybe we might say that what we're breaking down here are kind of the economic illusions a little bit of modern society. And so, some of these illusions might be, again, industrial productivity. It's not 1760. It's not 1880 and 1870 during the second industrial revolution, we had the steam engine. We're not in a period of industrial productivity. People think we are with AI, but AI is just sort of a scary kind of speculative investment, as we've discussed. But maybe the internet, why is that not a new scheme or new phase of industrial productivity? And I think the reason why it isn't is because the internet is another software update that kind of fundamentally invalidates something about productivity, something about industry, something about looking at everything in 360 degrees, turning into an object to put into markets, creating a market society so that everything is a market object, radically commercializing society, then building a series of political freedoms on that basis. That's been the capital S society. And so I don't think that there's room here for us to say, well, we actually do have a new phase of industrial productivity. So what else then is left in this equilibrium strategy? If we need industrial productivity so that we can have a valid place for the state in which to act, and therefore the state can continue to be the mediator through the monetary system of the cycle of wages, which equal taxes, which equal revenue, which equal sort of pure money or money that comes through central banks, then that becomes investment capital for private companies who then filter it back into wages, which is a system that never even necessarily worked that well. And certainly in the financialized era, it's a totally broken model, because at the moment we synthesize enormous amounts of our economy, enormous amounts of the financial system with private money. So this is one of those kind of towering illusions that convinces certain people, certainly these academic economists, that they have a working model of society. It's simply a question of getting there politically.
Yeah, well, that to your last point, I was thinking about that in terms of Mamdani, right? Was in terms of subsidizing things like housing or transit or groceries. It's actually in some ways like the criticism that you sometimes see of things like abundance politics, right? Like when we have abundance politics and there's this idea of organization, or that we are just allocating things wrong, but there's no like production side reform, right? Like there's no there's no idea of like, well, where is this coming from, right? Like if everyone can get a phone, but if everyone should be able to have an iPhone 14, but if the battery in the iPhone 14 or 15 is mined by lithium miners who are paid a brutal wage and who die early, or and then if we're subsidizing consumption inside a very, very fragile system that is only able to produce things through highly financialized, speculative, risky, exploitative, if we're not doing anything to examine our production, and then we subsidize things like that, we subsidize demand or consumption or even supply, but we're not investigating the mechanics of the supply, then what are we actually doing? Is it really that radical? Is it really that revolutionary?
But I don't think the idea, and this is going to sound cruel, is to get rid of exploitation. I don't think that commercialism is exploitative. I think commercialism is a reality principle. It's a way of looking at reality. The moment it gets maybe exploitative is when, as a reality principle, it doesn't work. When something about our concept of reality, and perhaps the reality we've built, it's not necessarily that it's colliding with really existing reality, capital R reality, but something about we're generating these specters, let's call them, what people in other contexts have called symptoms, what the central bankers and finance ministers of the world are calling the excessive imbalances, right? The giant debt problem. We create problems that seem to emerge. It's almost as if we go to sleep every day, right? The metaphor for our society and our system. And the machines that we've been working with, right, which we operate, and there's still some kind of, basic organic relation between us and the machines, wake up in the middle of the night and they start doing work without us. But instead of building us houses and clothes and whatever things that we think we need, and tilling the soil and growing food for us, they do other things. And it's almost like you cannot stop the systems or the machines that you've built from waking up in the middle of the night and doing certain things when you're not looking. And in fact, it might just be that it comes down to how you've designed those machines. And the truth is that our system, which I can't exactly call a human design, I don't think of it that somebody woke up one day and said, let's design this. But it's also not something you find in nature. And this is an interesting paradox that we get with respect to market society. But this market society does things when we're not looking and without our asking. And it creates these excessive imbalances, these exorbitancies, these inefficiencies that we don't see coming, and that no amount of theory will be able to square into the system, because it will seem like it's a deviation. It'll seem like it's an interruption. And there have been many examples of this. I mean, from debt itself to the working classes of the 19th century, to the colonies of the 17th and 18th century. And more recently, we have, I think, to me, there are two great sort of examples of these exorbitances, other than the fact that we synthesize our financial system exclusively with money. So we kind of fake transactions. We don't actually have much underlying productivity. But the excessive amount of objects, the fact that we all have an iPhone, and there's this kind of zombified productivity that doesn't actually reinforce a meaningful image of market society. The fact that we have all these objects and we don't know what to do with them. The fact that they're kind of too perfect, and maintaining the production line to keep those systems open, to keep those operations of production open, actually costs us so much more than we can imagine. Like, independent of the ecological cost, it's literally the social cost. Again, the paradox is the economic cost of economics. The system that is kind of infected with itself, but also, again, the internet, that we've not been able to do anything with the internet to come up with an internet society. This feels like a kind of catastrophe in terms of just like we do not have the freedoms we think we have, because liberal freedoms and international cooperation and market productivity and even industrial productivity are just not equal to something like the internet. And we're desperately in need of a new perspective, a new set of principles, a new critique for the inefficiencies that have existed, but also a new kind of leap of faith, a new kind of decision where we're willing to create another system, which you have to make the leap of faith in order to see its particular application and its usefulness.
Totally. And so I wonder, does this lead us to maybe speak a little bit about what is potentially missing from things like this, from these critiques, or even from this support, I guess?
Well, there's in a recent article by one of the economists under consideration. One of the economists, again, that signed this letter to Mamdani, which is sort of the list we're referring to here. And it's an economist named Daniela Gabor. And, she wrote in the Financial Times, and it's an interesting article. It's a critique of something we've spoken a lot about on the podcast, which is the money that is being raised in Europe to help pay for, things like, decarbonization, but also, of course, as we know, for massive remilitarization. Now, her emphasis is not much on militarism. She takes quite seriously the claims that there's this big decarbonizing process. And as a side note, when we do, let's improve our infrastructure for climate, we do not escape economics. Climate infrastructure is not a monetary problem. It's not a savings and investment problem. That's why Biden was able to throw hundreds of billions of dollars at the problem. And of course, there wasn't enough time in a maturation process, and Trump was eventually elected in, but it wasn't going to work anyway. You can earmark $200, $300, $400 billion. But as we're saying, if you don't have some reform on the production side, your society is too expensive to continue. The systems are toxifying. Money is useless because it's not helping us coordinate non-monetary operations. So money, which is supposed to help us do other things, is getting in the way of that very job. But she writes an interesting comparison between Europe and the United States of America. And she writes, and I'll read it out. American-style finance, if you follow the money, inevitably produces a privatized model of welfare. As pensions swelled into trillion-dollar asset pools, asset managers and private equity in particular promised attractive returns by turning social infrastructure into investable asset classes. Today, this could be a plausible scenario in European capitals seeking to meet NATO spending commitments. There's a lot going on there, but I'll break it down very simply in saying, well, one, she's worried of going with the private sort of welfare model of you get efficiency from society if you privatize everything. Now, there was a time, remember, go back to the 13th century, and you have the monk who has his irrigation system. Can we turn irrigation into a commercial and or market affair? Well, you can most efficiently do that through the state, which is eventually what they're going to do. And, you know, but 200 years later, and the governments of people like Henry VIII, this is what they're going to do. And this creates the modern state. When they start to take on the commercial reality of organizing irrigation or infrastructure, doesn't mean they're going to start selling it, but they're going to think about it in 360-degree terms. So it's funny that, you know, since 2008, but really since the 1970s, there's been this regime of privatization where companies who have not been producing any actual industrial productivity have said, well, why can't we sort of fake productivity by trying to convert everything into one of these so-called asset classes? Turn it into a big bundle of debt, which people can imagine and think of as something productive and can bet on, but you obviously move the entirety of your economy into the stock market. And this is the process of financialization. So this is what she's criticizing. She's saying Europe doesn't necessarily want to do this because it turns your healthcare, it turns your schools into privatized affairs. Privatization doesn't mean they're owned by private individuals. It means that they're even more radically commercialized than, even any stage of market society has ever been able to imagine. The difficulty for this is obviously that you might say, well, wouldn't capitalism like as much privatization as possible? And I'd say, well, eventually there is too much privatization and it toxifies the system. That doesn't mean you go and create the welfare state 2.0, which is, of course, the solution of many progressive economists. Okay, well, we need then less privatization. We see it with Mark Carney, who's a different class of thinker and different politics, but it's the same, right? He's a progressive economist. And the idea that we can somehow recreate the welfare state with, say, sustainable finance. The reason why they're so attached to this idea is because they say, privatization toxifies the system and it destroys the capacity for economic metrics to give us good readings of society. That's basically what happens. So we need always a constant form of state-backed political, social mediation. The ultimate paradox of this, and this is maybe the core paradox of progressive economics, is that society is a market society. There is no naive society over there. We pretend as if buildings were always built in this way, that money always looked like this, that trade always looked like this. No, we have had specific ideas of trade, of wages, of revenue, of taxes, of buildings since market society. Take away privatization, try and control it. There is no society to which you can refer and use as a basis for creating standards and categories on the basis of which you might say, let's do the process in this way. We don't have that society just waiting around.
Mm-hmm. But maybe the internet provides us with some form of getting closer to something like this, right? Like moving post-market, moving beyond capitalism, because I think that's ultimately the big critique, right? Is like, is Mamdani's platform post-capitalist? Not really. It's like social democracy funded by kind of like the leftovers of capitalism, or the like little bits and bobs that we can somehow extract from stock transactions or from whatever. Whereas we might need to, like you said, these metrics, right, that supposedly tell us something real about society or about commodity, are maybe not working anymore. I mean, first of all, maybe never worked, but really have broken down. Because we can't do anything anymore, right? We can't invest in public infrastructure. We can't, like you said, it's not a problem of economics. This issue with the green transition, right? I mean, I just saw that article come out about David Suzuki where he was like, it's too late for the green transition or whatever, right? There was some like, totally catastrophic take on it, but it is true that it's certainly too late to solve it by throwing money at it, or by investing, or by organizing debt in a way that will go towards the green transition, right? We have to move beyond price or whatever to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want a Green New Deal. I don't think we should want a Green New Deal because it lacks that point that you made earlier about reform of production.
Right.
And again, to your point now, it lacks that point about reform of society. That if we don't come up with another concept of society, which is not easy, because you don't just pull society out of a cloud. But if you don't come up with this, you're basically screwed. And I think that what the internet adds, which is kind of a bit strange, is it adds, I think basically in 2008, when I think the system, as we have known it as capitalism, crashed. Because 2008 was created by conditions that began in the 1970s, when the last great era in which a New Deal could have existed. When it was possible to talk about equilibrium, to talk about industrial productivity, to see economic measurements and metrics as having some fundamental purpose in describing reality. But when you move into financialization and you start synthesizing transactions, right, whether you're, as we do in the post-2008 world, pumping money so as to give the illusion that there is something happening in society, and then you just have bets on bets on bets and, derivatives markets and et cetera. And again, I don't just use derivatives markets as an extreme example. To me, every single part of modern market society functions like a derivative. Derivatives are not, they're not the sort of boogeyman. It's an economic form that is everywhere right now. But also in the instance of the 70s, moving into the 80s, and the deregulation of the banks and various other moments, and a nice phrase that comes sort of effectively from critiques of Thatcher, private Keynesianism, right? The huge burst of credit. Everyone will get a credit card. Everyone will use credit. This is a way of faking productivity.
Right.
And again, or it's the asset bundles and bundling them up that lead to 2008. Let's put everyone's houses together, and it will give the impression that we're creating wealth and creating value. So you have these pillars of fakery that emerged in the 1970s. This is what we mean by the process of financialization. This is also the process that creates globalization, which is basically fake market trade, if you can imagine that, using cheapness to supplement lost and missing productivity. We've just reached this absolute point where how can the system possibly go on? But we've continued it for 17 years since 2008, almost impossibly. But it's the internet that emerges, and it's almost like maybe the reason we didn't do anything after 2008 was because we're like, okay, well, we have the internet. And whether people said that out loud to themselves or not, I don't know, and probably not. But it's almost like, well, but we just built the most amazing thing ever. We just built the greatest product in the history of capitalism. It's called the internet. We're safe. But what they didn't realize is they created something that transitions us from capitalism, that is a better software update than the one we got 700 years ago. This we haven't followed. And maybe it's worth mentioning sort of two other economists that kind of are kind of in this sort of stage of getting at the structure of progressive economics, kind of breaking it down and understanding what is the alternative to this view of the internet, or this view that, it's not broken, it's just about fixing the tax system, figuring out how to get the welfare state back up and running, arguing against these sort of right-wing conservatives and trying to say, no, affordability is actually essential to any functioning economic system, which they're right. If people can't afford dental care or don't have social security, you basically don't have a modern economy. But the question is whether the concept of the modern economy is invalid. So there's a kind of second guy moving up in this kind of tier, which is Adam Tooze, who is the biggest Substack in the world. And he approaches economics in this way that says, no, we don't believe in equilibrium anymore. Money isn't neutral. And there's no difference between what are called real and nominal values, which basically means he thinks of the entire economy as a giant accounting problem. If Daniela Gabor is this sort of welfare economist, we need to deal with inequality by rebuilding the welfare state. Adam Tooze is that economist who says, no, let's use fancy debt. Let's use complex economic identities, which are constantly changing anyway, because we're constantly opening new sort of monetary circles, economic circles, and then they close as this kind of economic alchemy takes place. So he's obsessed with what are called stock flows. Don't think of stocks as stocks, think of them as flows. They change. Everything in the economy has its identity changed. So everything is in flow. There are no specific points where there's one kind of general equilibrium or one kind of a sort of one use or function of money. So this is the ultimate way of saying, what if we just turn the economy into the ultimate Wild West, in which we produce economic variables, but we don't try and rein them in politically. This is the ultimate ideology that says, no, there was no particular moment when economics began, no particular moment when market society began. Finance may have been important, I don't know, it's just another variable, or commercialism of land, or the commodity form. Oh, sure, it's interesting. But it's not taken as if these things emerged at a particular point in time, that the particular technologies, that there was a software update to reality. All of this is rejected, and it's as if we have this perfect picture, and everything can be treated as an economic variable, and that is a natural state of affairs. It's not like much of a surprise that this guy has literally no political solutions, right? He's able to say, oh yeah, 2008 was a disaster. What were people thinking? And maybe the reason why he avoids, falling into certain traps of, libertarianism or even welfare economics is because he's almost obsessed with looking at, every economic variable can serve as a jumping off point for some new economic decision or scheme of productivity, and it's reining it in that is the big mistake. But I fundamentally do not know how you could possibly describe economic variables without having a serious theory of markets, a serious theory of commercialization or financialism. And I think the reason why much of modern economics avoids giving this is because they do huge amounts of modeling. They just assume that the information is natural and already exists. They abandon any of the older economic tools of searching for equilibrium, so any of the basic kind of political economic tools, and they abandon a theory of value. They don't attempt to say that there's some particular value that economic objects have or hold. And the truth is, I would agree with them. The attempt to come up with a theory of value in the very beginnings of political economy was kind of a bit of a delusion. There was no particular value to the commodity. The commodity itself gave us a concept of value because it transformed society. It gave us a concept of reality. And maybe the final economist to mention is Varoufakis, in that I think that he's probably the biggest proponent that the internet can be a new scheme of industrial productivity, or that we have always sweeping economic transitions, and they happen throughout history, and economics is basically a philosophy, a sort of political philosophy of management, which organizes resources, organizes technologies. But even he takes for granted that these terms like resources and products are astonishingly reified, that they're not just there, that other things have existed, and yet nonetheless, we're not going to go back to those things, that it's about these software updates, that we need a kind of theory of reality through software updates. And the internet was the most recent one, and it's not surprising that all of his political philosophy, he hasn't really come up with a let's build the internet society political philosophy.
Right. Much of Giannis's thinking is still, public, digital wallets is somewhat of an internet thing, right? That's one thing that we haven't spoken too much about. But yeah, sort of like removing Wall Street having a monopoly on money, right? So that there's no speculative money, credit cards, predatory lending, derivatives with a ton of risk, right? Like moving the central bank to become like a public utility versus kind of like a technocratic tool that reaffirms Wall Street, but still retaining kind of the idea of the central bank, not doing quantitative easing, but doing UBI, right? So instead of giving a bunch of money to the banks, giving it to the people, but it still relies pretty heavily on a concept of monetary policy, I guess you'd call it.
It relies upon money. You just, at the end of the day, you can do it for these various different metrics. You can identify your economic variables in this kind of protean, chameleon way, right? In this kind of Adam Tooze-esque way. Mm-hmm. But it's still money. It's still money thought of in a very specific way. Money is a commodity, which is a 700-year-old idea. It's a beautiful idea. And it means that this idea that, let's say, again, you take the digital wallet and we use central banks. You need to come up with a totally different, not even just use for money, but almost a majorly non-monetary society, right? So that you can actually have it so that there's a sort of significantly deflated role to something like a central bank. In other words, the central bank will not be organizing things. In other words, the central bank doesn't really need to exist anymore. This is the institutional step we're not willing to make, among other steps. I love Varoufakis' idea of digitizing a number of our processes and procedures, but I wonder what will happen to the integrity of these procedures the moment they don't exist in a market society. Won't we just have to come up with fundamentally different procedures? I much prefer, for instance, his example around Uber and or Airbnb, where you take these things that are clearly public utilities, which don't have to be thought of as utilities, but are basically things that we're going to do, like public transit, right, like housing, but we're going to have to start describing these things without markets and without economics. And we've discussed this before. We want to discuss them as material enterprises, which the internet allows us to organize.
Yeah, well, this is what I was going to ask you: is it that we should basically start a process of decommodification, that certain things shouldn't have prices, and that the true costs, right, so social or ecological or labor, like we've talked about, like, does the internet allow us to organize things in a decommodified way through their kind of true costs, right? So like through participatory pricing, I don't know, provisioning, but divorced from speculation, scarcity, externalized costs, things like that. Is that the move that the internet allows us to get to, or I don't know?
Yes, but without prices.
Right.
There will be no participatory prices either. We're not dealing with a system that is simply predatory, and that's been the problem.
Right.
The predatoriness, which emerges in many different aspects, whether it's the predatoriness of bankers before 2008, or frankly, the predatoriness of the liberal revolutionaries in the French Revolution, where a certain pitch of reflexivity is reached.
Right.
And rather than saying, well, is there another software update, right, you just try and reinforce the present system in a new, clever way, right, trying to ignore that it's clearly a specific way of doing things, but maybe a specific way of doing things we're addicted to. We can't think of something more real than it, and this creates certain political deadlocks. But what we want to imagine is that the internet just does this already. We recreated, or we created for the first time, materialism through prices. Economics, at the end of the day, was a response to a commodity, the commercialization of land, finance and investment as a primary input of production. Economics didn't create these things. Economics responded to this. And in fact, it responded almost 500 years later, right? And what that means is that we have a particular materialism that emerged 700 years ago. And we don't need to use the language of that materialism to describe reality, which means we need a new materialism. We need a new way of describing things. We have described much of the world in terms of prices, in terms of commercial efficiency, in terms of market accessibility. And in this most recent phrase, we've just created much of the mathematics and the models for it. But what we need to be able to do is say, can we come up with a new materialism? Is there a new materialism inherent in the internet? There absolutely is. The internet is the ultimate way of organizing information without prices. It creates information naturally, which means I don't need a price system. I don't need the organizing form of a price system in order to describe objects to me, right?
Right. Well, this also helps us with things like, I don't know, the green transition or whatever you want to call it, where like the focus is on, things like regenerative farming or whatever, rather than extractive farming, right? Like things that are not profitable, but are necessary, or I don't know, child rearing or communal transport, or all these things, right? Things that are not necessarily, that just kind of wouldn't be possible in a system of pricing, right?
But I don't think that this emerges because suddenly we get back to sort of our ingrained and social values. One of the things we discuss all the time in the Green Priorities podcast is that when you start looking at materialism, and actually maybe you look at it through the internet, because that helps guarantee this view of materialism, you start looking at things like energy. You start looking at sort of the natural efficiencies of the materials.
Right.
And then you start talking about regenerative farming or no-till farming or whatever. You start looking at alternative ecologies and alternative agricultures. which are not there because you want to accomplish a green transition, but they're there because once you have this new kind of materialism, right, you start looking at things differently.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a difference that is just a kind of social difference. It means that for the first time in 700 years, or maybe ever, we're able to look at a kind of materialism that radically prioritizes the material efficiency of whatever the process is that's being done. And this is what the internet allows us to guarantee. And so while we need to take some of Varoufakis's points as sort of, you know, points from which to jump off and sort of look at, okay, how are we going to guarantee certain, I don't know, what has the central bank been?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and if you go and, you know, is it about, as you mentioned, decommodification? Again, the internet just works without commodities. So the best form of politics is just to expand the internet society. Don't try and remake the old society. Don't try and find a digital central bank. Don't do it. Just figure out what does the internet society impose upon you in terms of the materialities, in terms of the agricultural technologies, in terms of the way that human beings should communicate and make decisions. That's the trail you need to follow. And again, you can actually rather cleverly look at many of the internet companies that have emerged in the last 20 years and see just what did they focus on, right? To an extent, maybe you could say, well, they digitize pre-existing things, but, you know, it's, you know, when we look at Uber, we see a particular way of traveling reinforced. We see a market concept of human movement, basically, I would argue. So probably we're going to have to come up with a new materialism for human movement.
Totally.
We're just going to, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, there's also, I often see people talk about, you know, when we talk about a shift away from like liberalism, which is like, I have a right to X, Y, Z, like a way to almost move past that or reframe it is in some ways to say something rather like, you know, as a society, we guarantee X, Y, Z, right? That was maybe the move more towards social democracy in a way. And it's interesting that if you follow the internet in a way, it's like, yeah, with Uber, you know, you'd say, oh, I have to earn the right to, you know, movement in this way, to order something directly to me that I can track, that I can do whatever, or, you know, even Amazon or whatever. But if the internet already works without, you know, commodities or price or whatever, that idea of, you know, you have a right to something or something is guaranteed to you is kind of inherent in the system already. So it leads us, like you said, on that trail of moving, you know, beyond perhaps individualistic liberal concepts of rights and private property and things like that.
It does, without necessarily coming up with a kind of, I'm going to be a little bit crass here, a kind of hippie-ish concept of collective ownership.
Totally.
Collective ownership is
it just
liberal,
exists. Yeah, it just, yeah.
Well, it just exists. And this is the paradox, right? And what do we mean by just exist? If it just existed, presumably it'd be right in front of us. This is why we still need the frame of the internet, to have the thing that just exists. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of the emerging materialism that we get from the internet, which allows us to redescribe all kinds of, whether they're natural processes or even market processes or internet processes themselves in a fundamentally new way.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, we move beyond the paradigm of rights and guarantees, though, in my opinion. I think you're right that it kind of gets, I won't say absorbed. I think we realize that rights were always a temporary technology, which will sound like very radical and strange. And what do you mean, will we not have rights? But I think, again, to the point you're getting at, something about existing on the internet gives you a new kind of freedom. And so maybe rather than talking about it in terms of rights and guarantees at all, we have to say those were temporary technologies for their time, but what we need to reinforce is the internet, time spent on it, which doesn't mean you have your phone in front of your face for 16 hours a day. In my opinion, what it means is that we're allowing the internet to organize more social processes, just as we've let markets do that, right? You can be an architect and you rely upon a market. Mm-hmm. A market of all kinds of things. You rely upon a market for your private consumption, just as you rely upon a market to sell your time and your designs, and you get concepts of value from those markets. Why not let the internet do this? Right? It has less to do with us moving onto the internet, digitizing everything, which is kind of a Frankenstein's monster more than anything. It's about the internet becoming this regulator. And I think that the internet, you know, yes, it contextualizes, I think, retrospectively, retroactively, the failure of economics as an entire concept, as a discipline, and also contextualizes the last 700 years of materialism. But also, we are just reaching, I won't say a breaking point. I actually think we could probably go on for another 20 years or 100 years. You have no we cannot underestimate how much we're willing to absorb in the worst sense.
Mm-hmm.
So we shouldn't rely upon the fantasy of a breaking point or of a catastrophe or when the excess. I mean, look, they've come up with militarism as the new form. I mean, this is sort of the obverse side of the progressive economics is, of course, militarization. That now elite decision makers will use militarization to get back industrial productivity. It won't work either. The money system and various other systems are completely broken. And alongside that, we have fractures in the internet system, right? Because people are desperately trying to figure out how can we continue market system, which relies upon something like taxes, but we have digital companies that basically can't be taxed because they're producing a new kind of value. Again, rather than handing over the reins of our society to Amazon and Meta, we need to fundamentally pursue this political project of the internet society.